Good evening, everyone. Good day for everyone gathered all around the world. I'm thrilled to be here with you. My name is Ari Melber. I'm an anchor and chief legal correspondent for MSNBC on what is an interesting and big legal day in more than one way. We're here at the Milken Global Conference, and we have an incredible panel. I'm going to bring them in right now. Many of these individuals on this issue of breaking the cycle of mass incarceration are people who walk it and talk it and live it. I'm just going to do very brief introductions because we have so much to get to. But as you see on your screen, we have Common, an artist, an activist, a musician, a leader on these issues. We have Governor Bill Lee and Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, which are just a statement of your commitment to this issue, having you here during what is a very busy time, obviously, for a bipartisan conversation, which I think we appreciate. We have founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries, Topeka Sam. We have Mark Holden, a leader at Koch Industries, which has done a lot of work on these issues, and Damien Dwin, a co-founder, managing partner of Brightwood Capital, and an advisor on the Vera Institute of Justice. I'm moving through that quickly because, as you can see, with this many leaders, I want to get to you guys. Normally, traditionally, you start with the elected officials. We're going to take an exception to that, although, again, it's so valuable that you're both here, and I think everyone's interested to hear what you have to say. But part of reform is about doing things differently, and I thought, while we want to hear some of the real-world examples from government, I thought I would start with Topeka and Common for the big picture view on this inflection point with the year we've had, with the role of COVID, which has been a tragedy in many ways, but also has forced new thinking. And a lot of your work is about new thinking, as well as obviously an election underway, a Supreme Court confirmation battle, much going on legally. So I would ask Topeka and then Common to really start this conversation about what's important right now. Topeka.
Well, thank you first for having me included in this conversation. And, being the only woman on the panel, I'm glad that you asked me, ladies first. Unfortunately, however, in the criminal legal system, that women are not looked at first, nor thought about as the most vulnerable population and the most marginalized. And so just to give a little bit of context around the work and around the numbers of women who are incarcerated and some of the issues that women face, 85% of all women who are presently incarcerated are mothers. 90% of all women who are presently incarcerated are survivors of sexual trauma and violence or domestic partner violence. 95% of all women who are presently incarcerated have some type of mental health issue, ranging from anxiety or depression all the way to more severe diagnosis like schizophrenia or even multiple personality disorder. There's been an increase of the rate of women going through incarceration, 800% in the last 20 years over the rate of men. And today, women are being sentenced to life in prison, double the rate of men. And so I wanted to give a little context, which is why I come to the work through my lived experience being incarcerated and learning about those things when I spent 3.5 years in federal prison in 5 different prisons and jails in this country. And right now, during COVID specifically, I just received an email today from a sister, LaVon Roach, who served 23 years to date on a 30-year sentence for a drug conspiracy charge. Mainly, it was her boyfriend. Again, we heard the numbers that led her through this. She has 3 kids, and she stated in an email to me, quote, in the last 23 years that I've been incarcerated, I've never seen or witnessed anything like this. Why do we have to be sentenced to death while incarcerated? Especially because we are serving our time. I want to get out of here. I don't want to die in here. And this is just one sister in Dublin, California. I get emails every day from sisters in the federal system. Aliceville, Alabama. We have Carswell Medical Facility, where that is where most women are dying who are presently incarcerated in the federal system. And then also in Pekin, Illinois, what we've seen is women of color are not being released at the same rate as other women being released from prison during these times. And so I know that we have a huge panel and much to share, but I wanted to give some context around the numbers, the data, since people are just very, very interested in knowing that. But most importantly, what are we doing to make sure that people aren't dying a death in prison? They weren't sentenced to death in prison. And then upon release from prison, They're being released without PPE. They have nowhere to go. They're being infected or even sick based on their existing health conditions because of the global pandemic. And my sisters are scared. And so I'll just stop there for now. The conversation.
Common?
Well, first of all, thank you once again for having me, and much respect and love to everybody that's on the panel. What Topeka said actually emphasizes where I'm going with it, is where, during this time of the pandemic, I was able with my team Imagine Justice to do a documentary that was a short film that was dealing with and talking to people who were incarcerated, and they really just felt like, man, they weren't being thought about at all. The way the system was handling them was like their lives were worthless. But I felt that it was really just an accent of what the correctional system has been probably since the beginning of its time, where it's really, when you think of the word correction or, rehabilitation, those things are not being serviced to people who are being incarcerated. I think where we are right now is, we all know that this system has been something targeted towards Black and brown people. That's not even, and as Topeka emphasized with women, it's even a bad situation. But overall, like, it's not good for America to keep incarcerating individuals and not giving them a chance to rehabilitate, to heal, to redeem themselves, so that they can, when they possibly get to come out, be better citizens. And just treat them as a light. It's like, if we don't value their lives, if we don't value the lives of people incarcerated, we're not really valuing our own lives. And it affects us in ways that we don't even think about. Like, I mean, really, I started this whole mission, for me, dealing with prison work, was because of the book, The New Jim Crow, and me sitting down, talking with the author of it. And I was really about trying to help the violence that was going on in the city. And when she tied that violence to people being incarcerated, and the cycle that happens when people, with fathers go to jail, mothers go to jail, and then come back not rehabilitated, how that perpetuates violence in our communities. I was like, that's not good for safety. We always cry, oh man, put criminals away. That's how we make our places and communities safe. But we actually are making it more dangerous. So, I mean, where we are is, we got to figure out and elect officials. I'm so grateful that we have elected officials that are on to talk about this, whatever party they're from, because we got to change the policies of this and change the mentality of it. It's got to be more of less punishment and more of a healing mechanism.
I mean, I appreciate you raising all of that, and we'll go to our elected officials next. Now, Common, it's interesting you mentioned Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, because so many of these conversations are evolving now. One of the potential upsides of the year we've lived through was people saying, I didn't realize it works like this. Okay, then maybe that builds the awareness. And although this is a serious topic, if I was brought here for anything, it would be to quote Common to Common, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, listen.
So let me send one back to you, and you tell us, and then we'll go to the officials here. Because on letter to the free, you talk about New Jim Crow. You talk about the teachings in that analysis of the slavery, Jim Crow roots of today's system. And you say the cage bird sings for freedom to bring, black bodies being lost in the American dream, blood aback being a pastoral scene, slavery still alive, check Amendment 13. Walk us through how you're linking your activism to your art, and then we'll go over in order to the congressman and the governor.
Well, man, Ari, it felt natural for me to address social issues that I seen going on in my community as a Black young man. Hip hop was part of what hip hop's voice was for me. I mean, that's how I learned certain things about who I am, through artists like Public Enemy and Rakim and Brand Nubians and Big Daddy Kane. So I knew art to be that, even from Stevie Wonder to Bob Marley to Bob Dylan, like these artists that would speak up towards social issues and just do it in a revolutionary way. Nina Simone, Aretha Franklin. So as I was going through my art and speaking like just what I saw, I eventually started. I read. I mean, I was reading books from Destruction of Black Civilization to the New Jim Crow. Fast forward, and I realized that within the scope of me doing the art, I also have to be a part of the activism. Because I felt that it was not enough just for me to do the art, but I do know the art brings people to the subject matter. That's how we bring a lot of people to the attention. Because what Ava DuVernay did with the film 13th was amazing. That informed so many people and educated me also. But also, obviously, like I said, the new Jim Crow did and different literature does too. But after that, what's the next action item? And now I feel like there's so many people who are in position of power, celebrity wise, that are really more active towards mass incarceration and ending it. From you hearing LeBron James talk about it to John Legend. It's powerful. And we have to, I feel like it's my duty, as Nina Simone said, it's the duty of the artist to reflect the times. And I want to reflect the times and also be active in these times. So that's where it came from. And, the more we get educated and the more we see political officials informing and we seek out, man, the more we can do and the more we can be microphones for these issues.
Congressman?
Well, Ari, it's great to be with you and this tremendous panel. I certainly thank the Milken Institute for convening us. When the failed war on drugs first began in 1971, 49 years ago, there were less than 350,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, of course, there are 2.2 million, disproportionately Black and Latino, a significant number of those individuals incarcerated for non-violent drug offenses. And so we've come to a place where America now incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, including per capita China and Russia combined. It's a stain on our democracy. That's the bad news. The good news is increasingly the mass incarceration phenomenon and the over-criminalization dynamic that exists in America is viewed as a problem by both Democrats and Republicans equally. It's great to be on the panel with Governor Lee because it's not a partisan problem, it's an American problem. And we were able to come together in 2018, take a first step and strike a blow against mass incarceration in ways that were designed both to help currently incarcerated individuals successfully transition back into society and to begin to roll back some of the draconian laws that had been put on the books as part of the failed war on drugs. And so now we're hopeful, particularly given the manner in which all of the pain and suffering and death that has been experienced by the American people connected to COVID-19, disproportionately in communities of color, disproportionately amongst those who are incarcerated, will help give us the impetus to do more. Because as Topeka mentioned, a prison sentence should not be a death sentence. But for far too many people, that is the case. There are things that we can do as public policy makers to address it, and I'm hopeful that we will in the immediate future.
And Governor?
Thank you, sir. Thank you all for allowing me to be on this panel. It's a privilege for me. I got involved 20 years ago before I ever thought about running for governor. I got involved in a reentry program that intersected men in prison a year before they got out and then worked with them for a year after they got out. I ended up deciding to mentor men as they re-entered society. And that's really how I first became exposed to the barriers, the inequalities that exist in our criminal justice system, the challenges for those who are trying to re-enter. My belief and understanding that we incarcerate many times the wrong individuals, that the right rehabilitation for folks oftentimes would not include incarceration, and we would have much better results if we diversion and alternative sentencing, and if we used efforts to actually address the challenges in these folks' lives as opposed to incarcerating them. So I started seeing that 20 years ago. And then when I was one of the reasons I ran on this subject when I was running for office. I was mentioned earlier, it's become a bipartisan conversation. Folks all across America have come to realize that we should be doing things differently. It's a difficult process to determine what those things should be, but I'm very committed to that. After I became governor, we made some changes initially. We're working now to develop more comprehensive legislative approaches to criminal justice reform. But this COVID experience that we've had has brought to light in a more public way to the general public why this matters. The general public doesn't think a lot about the incarcerated in our country, but when they're presented with the issues that have come up during this COVID crisis, they're forced to think about it. And whenever I go around speaking, I try to remind people, and actually Common said earlier about our new understanding of what makes communities safe. We used to think it was to lock everyone up who did anything wrong. The reality is, and I tell people this, if you want to know why you should think about the incarcerated, 95% of every single person sitting in a prison cell or a jail cell is going to get out, and they're going to enter our communities. And if you want safe communities, then you ought to think about how it is that we deal with them when they come out, and we ought to think about who it is that we put in. So I'm honored to be on this panel. I think it's a very an incredibly important subject for our nation. I think we're in a unique time that folks on all sides of the aisle and all corners of this nation are talking about what it is that we need to do things differently.
And bringing Damien in as a reformer, how much have you and other groups been able to use the moment or the pressure of COVID as a reality to make change?
Well, Ari, thank you for the opportunity. And again, I just want to congratulate all the panelists for the work they're doing in trying to reduce this system. With respect to what Vera Institute has done in this moment, Ari, it's interesting. We're a 60-year-old organization, 300-person staff, and we partner with government at all levels to try to essentially shrink the system and improve conditions within the system. And our research has shown, among other things, this is no longer an urban-only issue. In fact, we're seeing as much, if not more, trouble in rural communities with mass incarceration spreading to all corners of the society. So our objective has been to work with local officials in this moment through the health and safety lens of COVID to try to make sure that everyone who works in the system and is trapped in the system.
I'm just going to mention for folks who can hear, I think we're trying to get Mark back on, and Mark's mic is live, just so you guys know, just as a TV moderator, I'll just flag that hot mic. But we are trying to get him in. But go ahead and finish your thought, Damien.
No worries. Look, the simple idea, Ari, is public safety. The system needs to shrink. We have too many people who are in jail unnecessarily, either for crimes they did not commit or for misdemeanors and non-dangerous crimes.
Now, let me mention for the governor and Hakeem Jeffries, which I'll throw this at both of you. Do you see anything constructive that's come out of COVID in the way governments are forced to reassess things?
Okay, they haven't called on me a while still.
I'll go to Congressman first.
So I think I heard the question, Ari, in the context of dealing with what I would call the least, the lost, the left behind, the most vulnerable amongst us in the context of individuals who are particularly susceptible to a highly deadly, highly transmissible disease in COVID-19 because of the proximity and the density and the conditions of incarceration. There have been some modest steps that have been taken to give the Attorney General the discretion to be able to release those who are incarcerated into community supervision or home confinement based on their vulnerabilities. But unfortunately, in the view of many of us, he's not exercised that discretion which was given to him initially in the CARES Act that was signed into law in March. Senator Harris, Senator Booker, myself, Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, have introduced the Emergency Community Supervision Act, which would mandate the release of individuals who fall into a variety of different vulnerable categories, those with pre-existing conditions, those who are over the age of 50, as well as pregnant women. That Community Supervision Act has been included in legislation that the House has passed. We haven't seen any movement yet in the Senate, but it certainly is our hope that, consistent with the bipartisan First Step Act that was previously taken by the Congress and signed into law by the President, this is one of a number of logical steps forward that we should be taking. And if we can come to an agreement sooner rather than later, many of us hope, this type of provision would be included in that agreement.
And let me see, I want to bring Mark in, who's been bearing with us, and I know you heard some, but not all of it. But if you want to speak, Mark, to the work the organization does in the context of both systemic racism, which has been raised here by your fellow panelists, and the current question on the table, which is, do you take the negative of COVID and find ways to lever that to deal with what were already existing problems in the system?
Yeah, thanks. So I was offline for a little bit there. Thanks so much for having me, and great to be with this great panel. I want to go back a little bit farther than COVID. I mean, if you look at our criminal justice system, I think everybody knows the way this worked. The war on drugs, it had nothing to do with public safety. It had everything to do with winning elections. And if we had cared about people, and if we had been thoughtful about it and really were concerned about public safety, we would have done the exact opposite of what we did do back in 1971 in the Nixon administration. And the whole issue was that if you go back to prohibition never works, but alcohol prohibition, they did not target low-level offenders. People could drink alcohol. You couldn't sell it, you couldn't make it, but you could drink it. If we had done the same thing in the criminal justice system, and starting in the 1970s with the war on drugs, think of the difference it would have been, because of the number of low-level nonviolent offenders in our system still today, decades later. And that you talk about original sins that our country has, that is definitely one of them. So what do you do from there? We saw what happened when it went to Reagan, to Bush, to Clinton, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks to the great work of Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Doug Collins, and others, we were able to get the First Step Act done finally in the criminal justice system. But every part of our system, it really, in a lot of ways, doesn't make sense. It's a system that's set for failure. And that's why we've been so excited with the First Step Act, which should have actually happened during the Obama administration, but politics got in the way then. But it did get done in the Trump administration. And that was the whole idea was, let's change this whole issue about locking people up and throwing away the key, because it doesn't work. The tough on crime stuff never worked. There's no data that shows it. What we've been able to show over the last 10 to 15 years, because of what the states have shown, is that you can get people healthy, you can get them out of prison. Some people don't need to go to prison based on data-driven practices, evidence-based practices. That's what we should be doing. So now we're in the pandemic and we're kind of stuck. And a lot of this has to do, obviously, with the bad choices we made as a country about racism in the criminal justice system. That's a big part of it. The other part is the power of prosecutors. prosecutors in our system really rule everything, particularly because of the war on drugs. It's a plea bargain system that they run. So they're the prosecutor, they are the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and we've got to fix that. You
Right.
look at some of the ridiculous sentences that have come up, whether it's someone like Patrick Jones, who was the first person who died of COVID in the federal prison system. He was a low-level offender, but because of the 100 to 1 crack ratio issue, he was treated as a serious offender, a much more serious offender. He had a terrible life growing up, like most of the people we talk about. He wanted a second chance. He couldn't get it. He ended up in prison. He ended up dying a couple of weeks after the prosecutors went after him again, saying, "Don't let him out, Judge," and the judge didn't let him out. So what we need to do is make sure that we are being very careful about who we start out with in the criminal justice system, making sure that prosecutors don't run the system, and making sure that we look at things. We're so much driven by the war on drugs and what it's done. It's never going to change the way we're handling it. Prohibition doesn't work. And what we've seen in the states with some of the new laws that they've passed about getting people more healthy, keeping some people out of the system, that's what we need to do. Last thing I'll say here is Nathan Deal, who was the governor of Georgia and a congressman, I was at a meeting one time and someone asked him what would be the best criminal justice reform measure you could think of. And he said K through 12 education. So that's it. It's about education. That if we can get our systems better and help people get healthier, a lot of the people in prison just need a second chance, and we can talk about that some more. But there's so much that needs to happen, and we have so many original sins in our country, and the war on drugs, in my opinion, is among the worst.
Really appreciate all of that. We're here for folks watching. We only have now about 30 minutes left. So I'd like to try a little bit of a lightning round and then have people build on it. So in a word or a sentence, I'm curious, given the year we're living through, and people might not have expected that in the middle of this pandemic and election, you would have one of the largest civil rights, anti-racism, long-running movement protests in a long time. I'm curious for each of you, given the different work you do, in a sentence or a word, something that you thought was constructive from this year, where you looked up and thought, well, this is a good thing coming out of 2020, or this advances the movement we're working on. And what I'll try to do is whip around quick answers and then come back around to expound on it, starting with Common. But a word or a sentence or something where you looked up and said, maybe we are going to make more progress this year. Common?
Progress was made when I was out on the streets and within these protests, and I saw people from so many walks of life, a lot of young people really speaking up, and I was getting educated as I was out there, educated on like how
the next
truly
generation.
care.
So I'm going to go around and
Yes.
see, because I'm curious whether y'all have similar answers or not, and then I'm going to come back and Common have you build on that. So I'm being a super moderator here, like when they talk about super precedents. So see
right,
the diversity of the support in the street. Governor? And we may have I can't tell if we lost the governor's shot or not. Congressman?
The fact that systemic racism has become a phrase that we recognize as an issue that's been embedded in the soil of America and something important to deal with. Maxine Waters quickly said to me that she remembers a time she couldn't even use the phrase without being criticized. And now it's mainstream in a way that I think is incredibly important.
Great. Topeka?
Arrest the cops that killed Breonna Taylor.
Mark?
For me, it was going through 3 different marches led by Black Lives Matter, my family and I.
Damien?
The awakening, this is everybody's problem.
Yeah. And so that's very interesting to just from people working on these issues, and I know we're working on getting the governor back, but the diversity of support in the movement that we're seeing out there, what we might call the mainlining of issues like systemic racism, just that framework is now at least a legitimate way to approach this to a wider number of people and not, quote unquote, something extreme. The movement on Breonna Taylor as an individual case, joining BLM, as was just mentioned. And so I'm going to try to go a little freeform here with the five of you. So we'll start with Common, and then my hope is you guys jump in and talk to each other, and I'll help with rules of the road if we get a traffic jam. Common?
Yeah. Well, I think it was, even to bounce off what Topeka said about Breonna Taylor, I think it's powerful that, first of all, God bless her soul and her family, but it's powerful that people are working towards that, like on a mass level, that you saw Regina King sitting there winning an Emmy with a Breonna Taylor shirt on, and then you see Breonna Taylor on the cover of Vanity Fair, but then you also know that Tamika Mallory and her family are down there working to try to get things changed, and we're having a discussion like, hey, this district attorney shouldn't be in there anymore. Like, those things are things that we weren't having these discussions before. So I know that these times have brought that about. And like I said, just obviously seeing young people, like I didn't know I was going to see like young kids out there, Latino kids, like really like passionate about what this is. And it just made me know that America has the humanity and has the heart. But, we just don't see it a lot because as Mark Holden said, it's like the systemic racism is the beginning of it, or as Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, we know that that's what this country was based on. So, that's what it is. But I do see progress being made. I'm an optimist, so.
Yeah, I would just add to that the reason why I mentioned Breonna's case specifically or her name, specifically again, is because we do not see and hear enough about women and the things that happen to women. So often those cases are just kind of, you hear the name once or twice, even with Sandra Bland, and then you don't hear it again. So the work that Until Freedom has done going into Kentucky, and not only just making sure that they're fighting to bring awareness, to do protests, to get laws changed around the no-knock warrants and things like that, that also they're actually feeding the community. We're working in order to change the system, because we cannot look at this conversation around mass incarceration, changing the legal system, without addressing the systemic issues of poverty. Poverty actually is the fuel that lands everyone through incarceration. Why poverty? People are certain people in poverty, people of color specifically. There's no resources in community. We want more levels of education, but we don't get that if people can't think about having safe housing and food to eat. How can they think about going to school? So once we start to address these other issues that are within our communities that disproportionately affects Black and brown people, I think we can then begin to rebuild systems and processes that help to care. And then lastly, I'd add that I think this conversation also around Breonna Taylor has helped to also bring together the idea of even police and corrections, right? Like as in one system, that we keep siloing all these issues. And when I looked at a lot of the legislation that was being introduced, even around police brutality and changing that we didn't want to include corrections, right? Look what happened to Sandra Bland. She was arrested, brought into a prison, and then she was found dead by hanging, lynching. So we have to understand that all of these issues are systemic, but they're also interconnected.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, I agree entirely in terms of the interconnected nature of it, and certainly the elevation of Breonna Taylor's name and that tragedy has been incredibly significant in lifting up a focus on all women. Prior to Breonna Taylor, there was Sandra Bland. Prior to Sandra Bland, here in New York, there was Eleanor Bumpers. But those names didn't have the sustained focus, I think, that we're seeing now, and hopefully we'll see moving forward to deal with this issue on behalf of all people. And I think, both as Mark and Common have mentioned, you've got bad public policy as sort of a foundation, resulting often in being implemented by problematic prosecutors, leading to problematic public safety outcomes. And I think one of the things that may be an outgrowth of this year with a focus on systemic racism is systemic transformational solutions. And that certainly is my hope. Frederick Douglass once said that it's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men. That speaks to the salience of education, I think, that Governor Lee was referencing by referencing Governor Deal. The other thing that I think, you know, here in Brooklyn, we say it a different way. If we don't take the time to give our children opportunity, the system will seize the opportunity to give our children some time. And we've got to break that system that has led to, you know, sort of a school to prison pipeline. And I'm cautiously optimistic, given the bipartisan focus and the commitment of activists like Common and others, that we're going to be able to get this done.
Hey,
If I could, I would just love to say we got to vote. If you don't put Hakeem in office, it's moot. And whether you're Republican or Democrat, the sense of energy and animation around disassembling the existing system and revisiting these structures, in my view, starts at the ballot box. We have to vote, and then after we vote, we have to recognize there are no reinforcements. We are the change we seek, and having great leaders assume responsibility, not looking for someone else to step in, is exactly what this moment demands. I'm glad that we have more research and analysis now than perhaps ever, but we need more data to empower change makers, whether they are elected or not. And then obviously the institutions in America, and often in many cases, are driven by money. And so it's interesting, prior to COVID, we had a labor shortage in America, and a lot of the conservatives who supported prison reform were of that state of mind because they wanted the human capital. They needed bodies for jobs. We needed more people just to put butts in seats. You go through a pandemic, we now have the exact opposite effect where we have mass unemployment, and we're going to have to think about how to dig our way out of this hole. We've had obviously unprecedented fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus. And the question before us is, will the fiscal stimulus create jobs? And will those jobs be accessible to people with records coming out of this era where we know having a record dramatically undermines one's ability to get employment in the United States? So I think we have to tie the two issues together. Institution building, which in many respects begins at the ballot box, and controlling dollars, the economics of our society and how we make capital available and provide incentives for everyone to have a seat at the table.
Hey, could I just add one thing? We've been talking about systemic racism, and I get that for sure. I understand that. I want to go back to the war on drugs because we all know what Nixon did. It wasn't systemic. It wasn't. They did it purposefully. That came out a few years ago. You'll remember with John Ehrlichman saying that the war on drugs had nothing to do with public safety. It was to destabilize communities of color so they wouldn't be able to vote. So that's not systemic. That's direct, right? That's one thing. And the other part here are all these collateral consequences we're talking about once you have a criminal record. And these one-size-fits-all programs, whether it's mandatory minimums or you can't get a job, you can't get housing, you can't get loans, you can't get licenses, you can't vote, that's just got to stop, because otherwise it just sends people right back into the system. And we're seeing that more and more. Last thing I'll say is I think it's an absolute just terrible what happened in Florida with what Desmond Meade and Neil Volz were doing with getting people who had formerly incarcerated and had criminal records, getting them voting rights, and how it all got shut down. And we got to stop that. And people will ask me about it and say, well, you're a Republican. And I say, well, I'm really I don't know what I am. But at the same time, the bottom line is we shouldn't worry about who they're going to vote for. If we don't let people vote in particular, we're telling them, regardless if they're out of prison, that they don't matter, that they're a second-class citizen and they don't have a say in things. So voting rights are so important, particularly in this environment we're in now and in every environment. And I hope that in the future that we don't make all of these things so politicized, but I doubt that's going to happen.
And I know Governor had you in and out, so if you wanted to weigh in.
Well, I'm not I have been in and out, and I apologize. I've been trying to keep up with the conversation, kind of hard for me to do, so I really do apologize for that. I think we have an incredible opportunity in this country right now because of the enormous challenges that we face. I've always believed, and it was true in my own personal life, the greatest tragic moments, the most difficult, even tragedies for me, turned into transformative seasons of my life. I think that's true for this country. I think the pandemic, I think the elevation of conversation around racial issues, I think everything that's happened in this country, even the nature of where we are in politics, lays a groundwork for what I think is a very hopeful future. I think out of this, we're learning things about education we never knew. We're learning things about criminal justice reform we never knew. We're learning things about healthcare and access that we never knew. We are not going to waste this crisis if we will take what we are learning and, from a bipartisan standpoint, move forward with the things that we can agree upon would make this country a better place. And when we talk about criminal justice reform, COVID has given all of us an opportunity to talk about it more, to talk about how to get less people incarcerated, how to deal more effectively with those who leave, and how to do so in a way that lowers the crime rate across our country, but most importantly, impacts human beings in a positive way. Reentry is about transforming a man or a woman's life, and about transforming their family's life, and about recognizing that the incarcerated are just as valuable a human being as anyone on the outside. And that is the motive behind this, on both sides of the aisle. But we have an opportunity like never before, and we should capitalize on that opportunity while people are listening.
And let me take that point to Congressman Jeffries in common first, and then everyone else can jump in, which is we're talking about this in the context of this year's protests, which had as a flashpoint interactions between police and often Black and brown Americans as a first contact. So much of what we've heard here from each of you, and I think our listeners can understand, is about, while that is a problem, a lot of the rest of the system, a lot of what comes after that. And so first to Congressman Jeffries, when you look forward, because we are a few weeks away from the resolution of the election, whatever happens, happens, and these movements go on, do you think it is important to broaden out the Black Lives Matter movement and policy conversation to all of these other things? Or, and this is partly just a strategic question, or do you think, well, something was hit upon this year that brought in more people, brought in even a more diverse set of people at marches that Common mentioned earlier. And so maybe you continue to focus on that while knowing there's all these other issues to get to as well.
Yeah, I think it is important to try to address with the fierce urgency of now the issues connected to the interaction between communities of color and the police. And we're endeavoring to do that with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the most forward-looking police reform bill ever to pass any house in Congress, and it did so with a handful of Republican votes as well. We're hoping to be able to build upon that. But I do think in the context of, for instance, dealing with the impact that mass incarceration has had in devastating lives, devastating families, and devastating communities, that we should look to reverse engineer the damage that was done by the 1994 crime bill, because though that was just federal legislation, it incentivized bad conduct and bad policy by the states by including, $9 billion in prison construction money, but saying to the states, you only get this money if you adopt these kind of war on drugs type of laws, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, 3 strikes, you're out type of provisions that accelerated mass incarceration. And it's gotten us to a point where we're now at 2.2 million. So I think it'll be important for Congress, after having taken the first step, that we can't simply say, well, reforming the federal system is sufficient. No, it's not. Because in 94, the federal government, Congress, and the president reached into the states, enacted bad policy. It's had real consequences. We now have to figure out how to go back into those states. Damien, the Vera Justice Institute are doing great work and reverse engineer a lot of the damage that was done. And I'm hopeful that we'll do that.
Yep.
Yeah, for me, one of the things that I've been focused on is actually I joined an organization called the Urgency 2020, and what we've been doing is identifying people down the ticket in different states, some of the swing states, obviously in some of the places where we see good leaders running. We go out and support them, like influencers. Like we have artists from Alicia Keys to Seth Rogen to Offset from Migos. And it's not, we're not only just saying get out and vote, but we're saying, hey, vote for Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, and going down and like really doing that. And I think what I'm saying is when we have Hakeem Jeffries in different states and places, we can actually get this system changed. And it's so many people who didn't believe in politics and the system who come from where I come from. But when you see Hakeem, when I see Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, or Kim Fox, and you know, it's like, okay, not only are we gonna do community work, but we can change things and will change things through policy. So I think now, you know, it's really identifying for us those people who are running, you know, for office, who are for changing the system and approaching the system from a standpoint of healing. I think even the words we use, man. I went to San Quentin and saw the building of condemned on top of the building, and I'm like, man, imagine a human being have to walk into that, and that's where they live every day. I'm in the building condemned. I mean, I think the whole approach of the mentality of it, just from that level, has to change. And I mean, Topeka knows, she's been dealing with it before, but I mean, the way Mark spoke to it, people got to be treated as human beings. And that's the one thing that out of anything I've found out when I went into prisons and talked with women and men, is that, man, we just want to be seen as human beings. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why our country is having a hard time doing that. And I think we can do a lot better. It's you know, and I know we will do better. So I just want to reinforce that.
Yeah,
if I can
appreciate that. I'll bring you into Topeka, but I'll bring you in. But I just want to give everyone the heads up. So we have about 9 minutes left. So technically, that's a minute 20 per person if we split it up. What I'd like to do is go around and let everyone reflect on anything else you wanted to say in reaction or your final thoughts. And one thing we had on our list to get to that really we haven't gotten to in depth yet is also reentry and what you do about bringing people back in as we go forward. We talked about early release from COVID. We talked about deficiencies in the system. What about all these people too? As the governor mentioned, sooner or later will get out, and some may get out sooner based on the very reforms we're discussing. So with that in mind, let's give everyone final thoughts, going to Topeka first.
Thank you. Well, first, I just want to acknowledge everyone here. You just spoke on just the humanity. And I want to acknowledge everyone's language usage, that everything was very intentional, very compassionate, empathetic. Everyone on this panel referred to incarcerated people as people. I heard men that I worked with from the governor. I heard individuals who are incarcerated. And so often we hear the inmate, the felon, all of these words that do not allow people to have the opportunity to have a second chance because you're looked at it as a thing and not a person. So I wanted to just thank all of you for that understanding, because while the people are watching, it's incredibly important that they understand that people are people. And just to address the reentry work. What we do at the Ladies of Hope Ministries is we work to end poverty and incarceration of women and girls. We do that through 2 buckets, which is direct service and sustainability, and advocacy and engagement. Our direct service work is we create housing We have Hope House, one in the Bronx. We have one in New Orleans, and we're scaling that through the 5 boroughs of New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Trinidad, within 2021. We also combat food insecurity, making sure that people have fresh bags of food every single day through our partnership with Instacart, Whole Foods, Wegmans, Fairway markets in these different states. We also partnered with Virgin Unite to create pathways for equity, partnering with 450 global corporations to make sure that they're giving people equitable opportunities for employment. And through our policy and advocacy work, we work with New Yorkers United for Justice. We've worked with Cut 50. I've worked with many of you around the First Step Act and passing dignity for incarcerated women, changing conditions of confinement for women while they're inside, and while we're working to decarcerate and give people opportunities, because it has been mentioned, there are over 44,000 barriers to reentry for people with convictions. And we have to understand that if we want the 95% of the people who are coming home to not only be safe and healthy to themselves and to the community, we have to open up new pathways for opportunities for them. And that's what we do.
Hey, could I just go quickly? I'll be very brief. Going back to the Bureau of Prisons, they need to change their name. That's so old school. I worked in a prison when I was 18 years old in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was a house of correction, not the Bureau of Prisons. We need to make it the Bureau of Rehabilitation or whatever else, right? And the other thing I'd say is that we need to get DOJ pretty much out of helping people in prison, because they don't. And it should be something where you've got the Department of Health and Human Services, you've got the Education Department, you've got DOL, the Department of Labor. If we're going to talk about getting people to get back into the game, we need prison reform, and we don't need DOJ just kind of, doing what they always do. Last thing I'll say is the best thing I've seen is up in Michigan. They have a vocational village in one of the prisons up there. The men up there who are getting jobs right out of prison, and women, 95% of them are getting jobs, really good jobs, and it has less than a 5% recidivism, which is amazing. And it's because they really take it seriously up there, and they get it done. It can be done. It's hard work, but we got to do it, because otherwise, we've been talking about what the otherwise looks like. So thank you.
Ari, I'll jump in. As has been mentioned, the system is too large and needs to shrink. Conditions within the system need to improve because they're currently inhumane. As I said, this is everyone's problem, Ari, and so it is not just that the system is racist and we have evidence it is racist. It is also that we know in states like Tennessee and Kentucky, in rural communities, white people are suffering under the weight of a prison and jail system that is too large and too inefficient. And finally, coming out of this virus, our economy is in shambles. And so it's not just that we have to vote and help put politicians in positions to affect change. We also have to recognize that employers are going to deal with an entirely different set of incentives and use cases than was the case prior to the virus. And with unemployment so high and us working feverishly to shrink the system, we're going to need to think really critically about what we're going to do to change the trajectory for all Americans, because our economy is in a very, very different place than it was just a year ago. And we're only now beginning to come to terms with those negative effects.
And I'd say, Ari, that, successful reentry as a public policy objective is a win for everyone. It's a win for the formerly incarcerated woman or man who is back into society, able to live, a productive life because we've provided them with the education or the job training or the substance abuse treatment or the mental health counseling that in almost every instance they had been denied upon the journey that they were on into incarceration. But it's a win for their families. It's a win for the communities. And successful reentry as an objective is a win for the taxpayer. because if we dramatically reduce recidivism, then we dramatically reduce the amount of money that is being spent in terms of incarceration. And right now, $80 billion per year is the classic example of a failed government program, because it's wasting taxpayer dollars and it's not achieving the public policy objectives.
Understood.
I'll add to that. I think,
Governor, I'm going to have you go, and then
Yep.
at the very end of the show, that last encore, you don't really want to go after Connell. So I'm going to have you
No,
go.
I know that's the reason I jumped in there. I could tell that. I knew that was coming, and I know how to not set myself up. So, Congressman Jeffries, you're exactly right. This is the reason that this can be done is because there isn't an argument against it in any direction. There shouldn't be. This is cost effective. It is the right thing to do from a human perspective. It's a taxpayer incentive. It works well for employers. There are no arguments for why we should not do this any longer. And I think that's one of the reasons that we can do it. I'll add one other thing before I stop. Topeka talked a little bit about the work that her organization is doing. I worked in a nonprofit reentry ministry called Men of Valor that has about a 7% recidivism rate for folks who stay with it for 1 year after, and we get with them a year before. The government is not the best at doing this. Like nonprofits, those who work on the ground, there are community groups and other organizations that are dealing face-to-face, boots on the ground with the incarcerated more effectively than the government does. We can, in the State Department of Correction, we can take best practices and implement them, but we should partner more powerfully in every way we can across this country with those organizations, those nonprofits, those institutions that are serving the government and do it more effectively than government can. So I'll just add that to my encouragement to all of us as we approach this from there's public policy standpoint, but from an implementation standpoint, we should engage partners more than allow the government to do it.
I've met some of the most beautiful human beings that were incarcerated that changed my life. One gentleman I met named Charles Alexander, who was doing he was doing life without parole at one point. And he was abused as a young man. When we got to talk with him and I sat with him in his cell and he told me a story. We were eventually, because of the system and the help that he had with ARC, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, and Imagine Justice, we were able to see his improvement. He was coding in prison. He eventually got that sentence halted and he's free. But what I want to bring up about Charles is now working at a company called Slack in the tech world. They took a chance with Charles. We need some of these corporations to say, hey man, we're not going to let these prejudices and the policies that we had before. We need courageous corporations, just like we need courageous politicians. I'm grateful to be on the panel where it's, people from different parties sharing in humanity and just talking. And we're not gonna always agree on everything. That's just like, I don't agree with my mother on everything, but the point is we find that humanity in each other and be able to get to that common goal. And what we're doing with the prison system is about humanity. It's about human beings. And I believe we can do it. And as Hakeem said too, another thing, just get down to money. I found out in the state of California, it costs $250,000 to keep a juvenile locked up. It costs $80,000 to send them through school or her through school from K to 8. What are we doing? Anyway, I thank you all for being here. I thank you all for speaking up. It gives me hope. Ari, you're a great moderator host. Thank you for supporting hip hop culture. And thanks to Milken Institute. Thank you for the work you're doing, Topeka, Hakeem, Damien, Mark, Governor Lee, thank you.
Thank you, Common, taking us out perfectly as expected. I'll leave it at that as the thank you to the panelists and to the Milken Institute and everyone watching, whether you're watching now or in playback later online. If you heard something you like, look up the person, look in the caption, the descriptions, connect with the organizations or the people that fit with you. There's a lot of work left to be done. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ari.